Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those of us who are joining us from across the Atlantic, and a very warm welcome to the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions. We would have loved to see you physically in beautiful Haifa, but the circumstances are as they are. And we are happy to conduct with this web conference that starts today and will continue through next week on 25 years to Oslo. I will say a word about the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions, which was established at the University of Haifa about 10 years ago, and became so relevant in this period of extreme conditions, global extreme conditions. And we have been conducting various events around the current crisis, which melts into a very serious political crisis in Israel. But today we are going to talk about another sort of extreme conditions. And this is maybe the permanency of temporarily the situation on the ground in the occupied territories that are already under occupation for 58 years. 27 years ago, when Oslo Accord was signed, I was finishing my PhD and preparing to head to a new destination, Haifa. Although I come from Jerusalem, Rami, we decided after the first Intifada that we don't want to go back to a city of intolerance, and Haifa was a new destination full of hope with the Oslo Accord. But things globally and things in Israel especially actually did not fulfill our hopes. Oslo was supposed to be a temporary situation, followed by a peace accord, two-state solution within 5 years, and all the arrangements that were made were temporary. However, as we see, occupation and temporary situations last for many years. And what we want to explore in this conference, that was organized by our two brilliant postdocs, Rottem and Oren, who I will present later. What we want to explore in this conference is how reality, which brings a new kind of normality, is created both from the top, from central government, and from the bottom, from citizens, organizations, and the actual life on the ground. So this is the theme of the conference. We have in this opening session 3 great speakers. Each of them will talk about 15 to 20 minutes, and this will be followed by opening the floor to comments, questions, and discussion. And we hope to keep the time frame of an hour and a half. So, our first speaker is Dr. Rosenberg Rubins. Rottem is a postdoc at the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions. She specializes in criminal law, particularly in criminal law and immigration, but her project during this year at the Minerva Center is about counterterrorism law. This is the topic that she will address today. Rottem completed her 3 degrees, her LLB, LLM, and the PhD at Tel Aviv University. She was the Heshing postdoctoral research fellow at the Hebrew University before she joined us. And we are happy to have you with us, Rottem. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eli. It's very good to be here today, and very good of you all to join us. I'm just going to share my presentation with you. So Does everyone, can you see it? Yes, okay. As Ellie mentioned, my talk here today focuses on counterterrorism law, specifically on the comprehensive 2016 counterterrorism bill, which was introduced by the Israeli government. This bill introduces new tools for combating terrorism or security offenses into Israel's criminal legislation. And in the process, it replaces several of the 1945 defense emergency regulations, as well as some other emergency legislation with permanent statutes. Now, before I begin, a word concerning the limitations of the research. First, it's important to note that my research, at least for now, is very much descriptive rather than normative. I'm not about to be expressing my own personal views about the legislation and how problematic it is or non-problematic it is, but rather what I'm trying to do is to identify the underlying logic of this counterterrorism legislation and the type of relationship that it envisions between Israel and Palestine and the occupied territories. And the second limitation of the research is that for now, it is not an empirical research. I have not yet begun, or I've actually just begun, looking into the ways in which this law is implemented on the ground, in which it applies to various populations. This is my next project. The current project provides a critical analysis of the legislation itself and the legislation process by providing a close reading of the final legislation, the memorandum bills, and the protocols of the Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, which was the constitution that drafted the bill. Now, the bill, with regard to the objective of the legislation, Clause 1 states generally that the purpose of the law is to create criminal and administrative tools for combating terrorism while taking into account Israel's commitment to international treaties and to human rights. The memorandum bill elaborates on this objective, emphasizing the need to strike a better balance between the one that exists today between combating terrorism and upholding human rights. And this should be done by replacing emergency regulations with conventional criminal law and criminal procedure. When it comes to the application of the law, the bill applies to terrorist acts that are committed in Israel, of course, and additionally, it defines many security offenses as external offenses that are punishable under Israeli law, meaning that the legislation would apply to them even if these acts are committed outside the state of Israel. The counterterrorism bill applies to Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, who since the Israeli disengagement from Gaza are brought to trial in Israel for security and criminal offenses. As for Palestinian residents of the West Bank, they are usually tried in military tribunals. However, the prosecution is free to bring their cases to the Israeli civilian courts as well. And moreover, the bill entails certain arrangements pertaining specifically to suspects and witnesses who live both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And this indicates that at least some of the powers of the bill are expected to apply to both populations. These rules make it easier for witnesses to testify or give statements without physically appearing in court in Israel. Let's take a look at some of the main administrative and judicial powers that are stipulated in the bill. And here I will try to be as non-specific as possible because the legislation is quite long and elaborate, and we'll look only at the main powers. So when it comes to administrative powers, the law states that the Minister of Defense may declare an organization or an individual as a terrorist organization or a member of a terrorist organization, respectively. This decision is made in accordance with certain criteria, which I will not go into here. The most interesting point, I think, for the sake of our discussion, is that here we see arrangements that do replace the parallel arrangements that have existed in the 1945 emergency regulations. The bill amended the previous mechanism for declaring terrorist organizations and terrorist members by adding a right to a hearing that did not previously exist, and by forming a special advisory committee to the Minister of Defense. This committee is supposed to advise the minister on his decisions, and also is supposed to revisit declarations of organizations or individuals as terrorists every 4 years, meaning that the legislation now has a type of periodic review of the minister's decisions. Other administrative powers include seizure and confiscation of property linked to terrorism, while in this case, the parallel emergency regulations were only canceled partially. Some of them continue to exist alongside the counterterrorism bill and grant similar seizure powers to military commanders and police officers. When it comes to the prevention or limitation of use of territory, this is a power to prevent individuals from entering or using a place that the police suspects is being used or will be used for terrorist activity or for the support of terrorist activity. So we see here a very broad definition, and this may apply, among other things, to activities such as rallies and marches and demonstrations. Here too, some parallel emergency regulations were annulled, while others continue to exist. And here too, the main change introduced into the bill is a right to a hearing, a procedural right. Finally, we have the administrative power to delay bringing suspects before a judge. Here we're speaking again of a police power, and this is a power to prevent, this is actually a power that was incorporated from a previous amendment to the Israeli arrest law back in 2006 after the Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip. And this legislation contains special instructions regarding the interrogation and pre-charge detention of detainees suspected of security offenses. The law permits here certain deviations from the regular rules of criminal procedure, interrogation and detention for longer periods of time. Just to clarify, we're not speaking here of administrative detention, but of regular criminal detention, the same type of criminal detention that suspects of non-security related offenses are held by. Next, the bill stipulates several judicial powers, such as extended pre-charge detention period. So this is the same principle. Again, we're speaking of regular criminal detention, but with some deviations from the regular rules of criminal procedure. Same goes for the ability in extreme cases to order the pre-charge detention of suspects in the absence of the suspect. This is, of course, not the situation in most regular criminal cases. And the law also introduces some new aggravated and mainly preventive offenses designed to prevent terrorist action. So after this very brief introduction of the law, I would like to discuss some of its wider implications. The formal narrative behind the law, which was pushed mainly by state representatives who drafted the legislation, was that the law was required for two main reasons. The first is the new and unique challenges associated with terrorism, in part due to Israel's disengagement from Gaza. Second was the need to consolidate and update prior legislation, both due to the fact that some of it was outdated and due to the fact that some of it was inconsistent with democratic values and relied too much on emergency measures. And I would like to suggest that this is true in the sense that the legislation does indeed represent a new understanding of both terrorism, particularly security offenses committed by Palestinians, and it's also influenced by a new understanding of the relationship between law and emergency. However, the true essence or the ramifications of this new understanding go beyond what is formally expressed and articulated in the legislation. So when it comes to the underlying understanding of terrorism, I argue that the counterterrorism bill signifies a gradual shift from an armed conflict paradigm for combating terrorism to a homeland security paradigm. While the armed conflict paradigm perceives terrorism as a military conflict between a state and an entity that is external to it, the homeland security paradigm views terrorism as a threat that materializes at home and must be combated through civilian law enforcement apparatuses such as conventional criminal law. Now, this is particularly true, I think, for Palestinian residents of the occupied territories who are accused of security offenses, because this population and these organizations were strongly in the mind of the legislator when enacting the counterterrorism bill. For instance, in the meetings of the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee, most of the examples cited by members and participants related to organizations operating in Gaza and the West Bank, and it was quite clear from the discussions that the main purpose of the legislation was to prevent these groups from functioning and their plans from materializing. The decision to do so using the Israeli Criminal Code embodies this notion of this population as a certain integral part of Israel. When it comes to the new balance struck between law and emergency, the formal narrative is that the legislation constitutes an improvement from the viewpoint of human rights and the rule of law. It was presented by the Department of Justice as an attempt to strike a new balance between exceptional emergency measures and more conventional legal measures. And to a certain extent, we see that this is true. However, I would suggest that it is more accurate to describe the bill not simply as a new balance between law and emergency, but rather as a formalization or institutionalization of the strategic combination of law and emergency. This is evidenced from the fact that the bill does not cancel all or even most of the emergency legislation. Rather, the bill was drafted with one eye constantly on the emergency legislation, with lawmakers careful to hold on to those regulations that still suited Israel and that are to be combined with the powers that are now in the counterterrorism bill. In fact, representatives of the Department of Justice emphasized that the idea was to enable the military, law enforcement agencies, and the legal system to combine the tools efficiently, albeit while giving some prominence to conventional criminal law. And this reality corresponds with the arguments of several scholars, such as, for example, Yoav Mechuzai, Karin Levy, and others, that law and emergency are not distinct in binary categories, but rather categories that typically work together to create a joint regime. And in this regime, emergency powers are just one more tool in the arsenal of legal tools. And in accordance with these views, I would like to attempt to move beyond the law and emergency dichotomy and characterize the new counterterrorism regime as a product of what Nasser Hussein has termed hyper-legality. Hyper-legality is an inflation of laws, rules, and legal mechanisms that causes the subjects of power to be over-regulated and over-criminalized. Hussein argues against the tendency to view emergencies as a temporary suspension of rights in response to a specific crisis, such as an attack or an invasion. He points out that today, most emergency laws are neither temporary nor categorically distinct from a larger set of state practices. Moreover, they do not constitute a reactive or event-driven response, but a structural and permanent one. We certainly see signs of these tendencies in the counterterrorism bill, which is a comprehensive, permanent, and primary legislation that complements prior forms of emergency measures rather than replacing them completely. In such counterterrorism regimes, the law does not withdraw in the face of emergency, but lives alongside it. The rule of law is not suspended, as described by scholars such as George Agamben, for instance, but quite the contrary. In a manner of speaking, legality is even intensified. But it differs, hyper-legality still differs from regular legality, and Hussein says that this is true mainly in two senses. Or that really hyper-legality operates mainly through two mechanisms that are not inherent to regular legality. So the first is classifications of person in the law. Hyper-legality creates new subcategories that represent different levels of threat in the eyes of the state. For example, we may be accustomed to using such terms as citizen and non-citizen, or friend and enemy. But today, in reality, we have many intermediate legal categories, such as enemy combatants, enemy nationals, terrorist suspects, infiltrators, unauthorized migrants, etc. This process of classification has a strong predictive quality and consequently, it involves many racial presumptions. And in this sense, hyperlegality is somewhat similar to racial profiling. However, it's important to note that unlike racial profiling, it does not exactly classify its subjects in accordance with race or any predetermined personal characteristic. Conversely, hyperlegality classifies individuals into legal categories and then uses this classification to enable the use of new and specific legal powers. So for instance, if in accordance with the new counterterrorism law, declaring an organization as a terrorist organization would allow Israel to use new tools such as extended detention or interrogation powers or other special administrative powers, then it just makes sense that an organization that Israel fears, that it fears its activity, would be defined and declared as a terrorist organization. And this is not necessarily done in any sinister way. It happens because these legal categories are flexible by nature and depend a lot on discretion of officials. So I think we definitely see this tendency in the counterterrorism bill to formalize legal categories such as members of a terrorist suspect, members of a terrorist organization, suspect of security offense. And once an individual is placed within this category, the state gains access to specific legal tools that would otherwise be more difficult to exercise. We also see that these definitions do not depend on nationality or ethnicity per se, at least not formally. They do not constitute racial profiling in the strong sense of the word. However, it is quite easy to see how Palestinian organizations and individuals become the main target group or the main suspects of this regime. And the second main characteristic is the use of special tribunals and commissions, special venues in the law. And certainly we see this in the counterterrorism bill. Counterterrorism bill includes special legal arrangements in the case of detainees suspected of security offenses, creates a new hearing mechanism, it forms a new advisory committee to the Minister of Defense. And these types of new legal procedures and commissions are very typical of hyperlegality. To conclude, I'd like to speak of some potential wider implications, and I want to be careful here because we're looking at the Israeli-Palestinian relations through a relatively narrow prism of this counterterrorism law. But I would like to suggest that, in a way, the counterterrorism regime might provide a potential model for governing the Palestinian population in the occupied territories under a one-state solution that is not based on civic equality. Because we saw that to some extent, the counterterrorism bill perceives the occupied territories as a de facto part of Israel, in a sense that it views Palestinian residents accused of security offenses as a type of homegrown terrorists. This doesn't mean that they are treated equally to Israeli citizens accused of security offenses, but the shift to the homeland security paradigm does come at the price of adopting at least some of the rights and protections that are inherent to the conventional criminal process. And some such rights have historically been designed to protect citizens of the state from state tyranny and have traditionally been tied to the rights and privileges associated with membership. So I definitely think we should consider the significance of Israel's new understanding of Palestinian terrorism as a permanent occurrence, which must be dealt with via permanent measures. I believe that the formalization of the unified law emergency regime, the idea that this regime can be a permanent or long-time solution, may signify an understanding that Palestinians have acquired a permanent position in Israeli society. I think my time is up. Am I correct?
Yes, you are correct.
Yes. Okay, so I'll stop here, and then in the discussion, maybe I'll make a few more points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rottem. It was a fascinating presentation. I will have some comments on it, but we'll do it when we talk after the three presentations. And it's a pleasure to have Dr. Oren Shlomo with us, also a brilliant postdoc of the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Condition. And Oren and Rottem were the organizing team of this conference. Oren is a political geographer focusing on political geography of cities, and did his PhD on the governmentabilities or governments of East Jerusalem, infrastructure and services in post-Oslo. Oren completed his PhD at the Ben Gurion University. He was awarded a Fulbright postdoctoral fellowship to continue his research in Jerusalem. And next year, Oren will join the Department of Sociology and Political Science at the Open University. Congratulations, Oren, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will just share my presentation a second. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so I will start with quoting. In his recent biography, former Jerusalem Mayor Nir Barkat praised the Palestinian demonstration that took place in front of the City Hall of Jerusalem, quoting, "There has never been a demonstration that made me happy like the demonstration of parents from East Jerusalem School in protest of a service that they did not receive, which was held in the front of the town of the town hall at the Safra Square. I explained to my office staff that I was happy that they were protesting against the municipality and not against the Palestinian Authority, as they see us their service suppliers and demand it from us. We have established the fact that the Jerusalem municipality is the sovereign. The demonstration was a significant milestone. Thank God, the residents of East Jerusalem are among all other groups that demonstrate against the municipality." This is the quote from Barkat in a recent biography. And now, the tendency of Palestinians in East Jerusalem to press claims on the state and the municipality for different social and urban rights is a new phenomenon that has become quite apparent in the last 2 decades since the collapse of the Oslo process and the building of the separation wall. It is developing as a part of a broader process that I have called in my former research the governmentalization of East Jerusalem by Israel, characterized by increasing dependency and forced adaptation of Palestinians in East Jerusalem to Israeli rule and governmental order. Rights claiming and demands for access to state resources by mobilization and protest are, however, the most political manifestation of these processes, as civil mobilization and protest are considered in the literature as the prime manifestation of political participation and a fundamental democratic character of a regime and society. In East Jerusalem, however, it has further implication as it may point to a greater administrative and governmental inclusion of Palestinians within Israeli administration and their growing involvement within Israeli ruling apparatus. Even though Palestinians in Jerusalem are not citizens and largely reject Israeli rule and resist it, this development may be understood according to what William Walters called an act of citizenship, that is a self-constitution that merits recognition as citizen in terms of service provision and access to state resources. It's important to note that these expressions of right claiming and accessing public resources are still a small portion of the social and civic activities in East Jerusalem. Most of these activities and organizations do not have any relation to the Israeli state, and moreover, they reject any part of cooperation with Israeli. Yet, for the residents of East Jerusalem who are not entitled for an Israeli citizenship and are not eligible to vote to the national parliament, and they are boycotting the municipal elections, these new forms of political participations, although sparse, constitute acts of some kind of participation or some kind of forms of encounters with the state by those who have been denied of citizenship, but somehow recognize the structure of power and the structure of governmental hierarchy. So there's some kind of pragmatic recognition over here. Evidence for this can be seen, for example, in the establishment of the East Jerusalem Union of Parents Committees in 2006 that works to improve educational standards and to preserve the Palestinian curriculum in East Jerusalem schools. Other examples include the Al-Quds University medicine graduates who campaigned and appealed for Israeli Ministry of Health professional recognition, Palestinian public transport drivers who engaged in the framework of an Israeli-based trade union, neighborhood struggles against discriminative development plans, and so on. From the perspective of the political history of the conflict in Jerusalem in general, this development may signal a significant shift from Palestinian non-recognition and rejection of Israeli rule to the utilization of state apparatus typically used by civil society to make claims on the state. This new development is best characterized by words of a central Palestinian activist whom I interviewed a few years ago. And he said, he called it, this is the new pragmatism. Today we do not ask whether to acknowledge or cooperate with the occupier. Today we ask what the occupier has to do for us. This new development raises several questions about changes in the relations between the state and the Palestinians in Jerusalem. For example, some of them. Does this development coincide or can be described as the starting of the building of Palestinian civil society vis-a-vis Israeli occupation? This is a far-reaching question, I know. A second question can be, what are the political subjectivities that are likely to be produced by this process on both sides? This is the dynamic process which comes after many years of brute and confrontation, especially after the second Intifada and the collapse of Oslo process. A third question can be, can this development seen to a point on an ongoing transformation of Jerusalem from an effectively divided or polarized city, as it has been described in the literature for many decades, to a mixed city where Palestinians and Israelis, Jews are sharing and competing for resources in one governmental system or one governmental structure. And the last questions, and most importantly, what are the implications of this process for the broader pictures of the dynamics of control and resistance in Jerusalem in particular, and on the conflict in general, given the fact that Jerusalem still lays at the heart of the conflict, and East Jerusalem if we consider it as a city by itself, a Palestinian city by itself, it will be larger than Haifa. So the extent here is very significant. While I will not be able to provide answers to all these interesting questions, I will try to draw some first insights from the urban geography of Palestinian protest in Jerusalem, linking the locations and type of protest, policing, and the possibility of the emergence of new kind of political spaces of participation, resistance, and control through the dynamics of protest in East Jerusalem. I will argue that despite what we heard from the former mayor, the option for Palestinians to mobilize and protest for rights and access to resources are limited and confined to well-monitored and managed events or demonstrations. Thus, they are deprived of varieties of mobilization and protest options to encounter with states. That means they have a small space to maneuver and to process, since they monitored and considered still considered as a security threat, even though we're talking here about demonstration and demands for civil or social rights. So for analytical purposes, let me first distinguish between three types or ideal types of protest, as seen through the literature on protest and policy and the policing of protest. The resisting protest, where protesters delegitimize and confront the ruling power or social order. Protesters in these occasions are likely to exclude themselves from the existing order and conventional deliberative politics, and do not expect to negotiate their claim. Often they don't have specific claims, but they rather seek to express rage and rejection of ongoing governmentalities. The managed or contained protest is a type of protest which plays by the rules. It is usually highly planned, approved, and managed by the police with the cooperation of the organizers. That's often described as a tent process. Location is important in this type since it is agreed upon with between the organizers and the police, usually will take place in a significant public urban spaces. This type of process is new in the relation between the Israeli authorities and the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The Palestinian demonstration that we talked about in the City Hall Square is one example among many others, which we will discuss later. The third and the one more conceptually and politically complex protest is the transgressive protest. Here, protesters are likely to disobey the formal arrangement of the demonstration and seek encounters with the authorities or the police in order to attract media or wider public attention. They might block the traffic and they will defy the police in diverse ways. In many occasions, the managed protest will develop to a transgressive one and will end up with physical or violent confrontation between the protesters and the police, arrests, and sometimes will go viral on the social and traditional media. This is one of the targets of the transgressive protests, to go viral. However, what is important here is and important to emphasize that this type of protest is widely considered as legitimate within the democratic game. And as I further argue, this wide expression of protest is deprived from the Palestinians, as any of the protest which is not well contained and managed is considered as a security threat and answered with harsh policing and involvement of the security services. So if we take a look at what happens in East Jerusalem, effectively, Palestinians in Jerusalem are left with the options of sheer resistance to Israeli rule, that is the resistant protest. As we saw in the urban or Jerusalem Intifada of 2014-2015, and particularly in the summer of 2014, when protesters went out to confront the police with rocks, fireworks, and improvised barricades every night for several weeks. Most of the protests occurred in the entrance to Palestinian neighborhoods on the seam line between Jewish and Palestinian areas. And at least at the beginning, the policy of the police was to try to keep it within Palestinian areas. By the winter of 2015, however, individual acts of terror, mainly stabbing and runovers, spread to the seam between Jewish and Palestinian areas and further to West Jerusalem, in what was sometimes being referred as the urban intifada, the Jerusalem urban intifada. Then the police response turned brutal. It changes its ammunition to a different type of sponge grenade that increased the number of casualties and the severity of injuries among Palestinians, especially youth and children. The main locations, again, of the violence were at the outskirts of the city, the village of Silwan and the Shuafat refugee camp, and to a lesser extent, also at the Haram al-Sharif and the Damascus Gate. As far as the managed protest, this is the new phenomenon in the relations of control resistance in Jerusalem. And these are the managed, peaceful, contained protests that we start to see in various locations in the city during the last decade or so. The prominent example is the demonstration at the City Hall Square, for example, in 2012, and on other dates and occasions. Elementary school students and their teacher protest against the severe classroom shortage in Arab education. Other examples are medicine students demonstrated near central hospitals in West Jerusalem, and the Palestinian bus drivers protest together with their Israeli colleagues in front of the employers. This is a Kavim company and Eget Arbora company. So they demonstrated in front of their offices in Tel Aviv and also in Jerusalem. And interestingly, these demonstrations were conducted within Israeli Jewish public spaces, which made them more visible to the public eye and more politically pointing to the turning the Jewish urban space to a more political space with a Palestinian political presence. However, A close inspection of Palestinian protests discloses that in other occasions of what we can call a civil protest, the police use excessive violence in order to dissipate the protesters. In some of the cases, leaders were arrested in their homes at nights and were interrogated and warned by the security services and not the police. One such occasion is the struggle of the village of Bet Safafa against the building of a new highway, highway number 4, through the village. The demonstration lasted 6 months in various locations, such as the construction site, nearby main roads, the city hall square, near the president's residence, and near the Ministry of Justice building. Many of these demos, especially those located at nearby highways and roads or nearby the construction sites, were met with harsh policing measures. Moreover, the security services, as I mentioned before, was involved and leaders arrested at nighttime and brought to interrogations. Interestingly, harsh policing was employed in protests that had transgressive potential that were nearby highways. When demonstration occurred in Israeli public spaces, such as the city hall or the president's residence, the police did not intervene. So, just quick conclusions on that. 2 decades ago, it was impossible to imagine quiet demonstration of East Jerusalem Palestinians at the Safra Square. The last 2 decades have given rise to a new phenomenon: Palestinians in East Jerusalem pressing claims on the state and the municipality for different social and urban rights. It is currently too early to assess the nature of this new phenomenon, but maybe we can assume that if this tendency of partial inclusiveness continues, Palestinian mobilization for rights claiming may increase their association with state administration and their visibility in West Jerusalem public spaces. It may also point to a partial and gradual shift from a divided city into a mixed city, into a mixed city model, at least politically, because Palestinians and Israelis Jews are still pretty much divided spatially in Jerusalem, but politically we might see a slight shift in the encounters and in involvement around mobilization and rights claiming. Now, having said that, East Jerusalemites' rights claiming towards the state and the municipality is still very limited in scale. As I have argued, Palestinian protest in East Jerusalem is limited to either tempt protest or violent resistance. The third option, a transgressive protest that includes civil disobedience and may attract wider public attention, is denied from Palestinians by the Israeli military establishment that classified such protests as security threats. Unlike transgressive protests by other minorities in Israel, such as the descent of Ethiopians or ultra-Orthodox Jews, Palestinians' transgressive protest is met with harsh policing and interrogation of protesters' leaders by the security services. That despite the growing containment of East Jerusalem Palestinians in Israel's services provision system and the labor market and the local urban economy, and their relative inclusion in Israeli governmental order in the last decade or 2 decades or so, they are limited in their option to protest for right and thus excluded from the political urban order. In most cases, Israeli authorities are working against Palestinian urban and social mobilization, thus shrinking the political space for exchanges on the basis of social and urban rights. And that's it for now.
Thank you very much, Oren. It was fascinating, and we'll talk about it, hopefully, after we can hear Dr. Nasrallah. And it's a really pleasure to introduce to you our next panelist, Dr. Ramy Nasrallah. Ramy Nasrallah is the founder and the chairman of the International Peace and Cooperation Center in East Jerusalem. He himself is from East Jerusalem. He received his PhD in urban planning from the Technological University of Delft in the Netherlands. and he was a research associate at the University of Cambridge. And Ramy, on the ground in Jerusalem, in your organization, you probably see new reality. We'll be very, very happy to hear your view. The floor is yours, please.
Sorry about this. Actually, it is a better arrangement that I'll speak after Oren. So I'll just also have to talk about the issues that he raised. I'll start by saying that we are talking about a city which is shifted from a metropolitan central Palestinian city in the heart of the West Bank into a frontier city. I mean, talking about divided and a mixed city, I don't think it's relevant in this case. Definitely there is some voices arguing that there is no conflict between requesting our rights, our civil rights, not as citizenship, but as an obligation of the occupier to respond to the basic needs of the community. There is these voices, but I can claim they are the one who used to live in the edge of the city. I mean, in the 80s, Palestinians were pushed out of the city in the suburbs, in areas like Aram, Azariya, Abu Dis. Those who came back, returned from these suburbs because of the center of life policy. Back in '95, they were subject to lose their Jerusalem ID, their permanent residency right. So those who believe that they need to be okay, between brackets, with the Israeli system in terms of showing the right document that they do reside in Jerusalem, that their kids are studying in a school. So they prefer the municipal school rather than the Waqf, which is like the Palestinian Authority schools or the private schools, if they cannot afford it. If we talk about how the Oslo peace process shifted the city from a metropolitan central city into a frontier city, we can go through different stages and they are all related. I can say that the first 2 decades of the Israeli occupation have to do mainly with the territorial domination of Israel, expanding the frontier of the Israeli city into a metropolitan Jerusalem for the Jewish, replacing the Palestinian metropolitan. This is exactly what happened at the beginning, and they didn't care much about the Palestinians. For the Israeli system, Palestinians were just numbers. The demographic engineering and the demographobia in terms of the ratio of Palestinians vis-a-vis the Israelis was the only policy that we can talk about at the first even 3 decades of the Israeli occupation. I think the shift took place only after the Oslo peace process, where we are stuck somehow, we are cut from the West Bank, and we don't belong to Israel, but still we are somehow living in the gray area in between the 2 systems. The Palestinian urban elite and the Palestinian economic base is still related much with the West Bank, not with Israel. So all the bankers, finance, high-tech, even commerce, they are all they are shifted their base from East Jerusalem when the closure started in '93 and it intensified with the construction of the wall in 2002. They shifted their businesses and their economic base from Jerusalem to Ramallah, which became the new administrative, economic, metropolitan, not even metropolitan, but I can say hub of the Palestinians. So I don't think that Palestinians at large are engaged in the attempt of accepting or not accepting Israel. This is not on the agenda. I mean, there's two schools of thought. One, which is the majority that Palestinian Jerusalemites, they are integral part of the Palestinian people. And we still believe in the national inspiration of having East Jerusalem as our capital, despite all the criticism on the Palestinian Authority. But this is I can say, the dominant school of thought. There is others, by the way, mainly from the periphery of East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is not a one unit, by the way. The north is different from the south, the most urbanized, the less urbanized. they're more dominated by families, by tribal affiliation. They're quite different. So we're not talking about one city in this term. The city of Jerusalem, what we call the neighborhoods of Jerusalem, many of these parts of the city, they're still rural areas. They are still dominant by families coming from the same origin of families from the same village. So we cannot talk about a one city in terms of the affiliation, in terms of setting an agenda. So the periphery of East Jerusalem, they have more acceptance to Israeli system, because it's actually preserving their right to be a Jerusalemites. They don't see a conflict between being demanding a functional right and the occupation. These are two different issues. So it's not about accepting Israel or accepting Judaization. And the irony of this, that some of these areas who accept Israel more than other areas, then I would say the urban elites, they are coming from a religious background. You know, they are, in sometimes even they take part in the activities of the Islamic movement of Israel, mainly the South branch of the Islamic movement. And that's a fact, especially in the south of the south neighborhoods or villages, you can call them as you want, of East Jerusalem. Now, I think there is a new element which emerged based on what Oren talked about of the Israeli curriculum. Having the 5 years plan, which I doubt now it's going to be with all the economic trouble and crisis in Israel, I doubt whether this will be having the same, I would say, result like the former plans. Even Barak in 2001 had a huge plan to impose the Israeli sovereignty and the Israeli rule of law on Palestinian neighborhoods. I don't think much been done since then, since 2001, with all the intention of the Israeli system to turn East Jerusalem into an Israeli loyal between bracket territory. There is a new element these days, especially with the COVID-19. Israel is now shifting from imposing sovereignty on territory into imposing sovereignty on people. There is an attempt to replace Palestinian institutions, civil society institutions, prevent any Palestinian function from taking place in the city for the benefit of newly emerged institutions. They are not new, but they are actually exist before with no recognition, especially community centers. They are still not politically accepted, but yet they are now getting more and more function. When a group of Palestinian institutions try to engage in awareness into providing even information on COVID-19, they were blocked and arrested by the Israeli police. They are violating the Israeli sovereignty, and that's a harsh policy which taking place these days in the city. The issue of Al-Haram al-Sharif, which is another venue where Israel is trying to impose its identity and its Jewish history on a Muslim shrine, that's already started in 2000. And the state, with its own agents, like the all these non-profit organizations of the settlers, the Amutot, they are the leading, I would say, player into implementing this Judaization or challenging the Arab, Muslim, Christian identity of East Jerusalem. We can witness it's not just by occupying Palestinian houses, it's also have to do with national parks, it's have to do with the cable car, it's have to do with many projects that Israel is implementing with the antiquity and archaeology, and with many other enterprise where the state actually give this settlers NGOs to take the lead and imposing a new reality. In terms of what happened for Palestinians, definitely there is some who are accepting more the Israeli citizenship. And that's not coming from an ideology, not from being more loyal. I talked about some of these groups are from conservative, religious background. They are more accepting than the urban elite of the city. The reason for that, at least 50% of Palestinians in the 80s, in the 90s, used to live in the suburbs outside of the city. And they returned back with the Center of Life policy in 95. And they want to prove their residency and to actually to show all the right papers to keep their residency valid. Until today, I don't see a major organization of community to try to shift from the individual survival techniques being used by all of us. We want to preserve our right to access the city by showing the right document, where your kids study, showing even consumption of water, electricity, gas. That's the type of documents you are asked to show to the Ministry of Interior. So that's everyone have the struggle on dealing with the Israeli establishment and Israeli, whether the government or the municipality, in terms of, you know, even volunteering to go to register a home. We violate the planning and building law in order to protect our legal status. I mean, many 1/3 of the built-up area of the apartments exists in Jerusalem. They were built illegal because there is no proper zoning and planning. So people yet were able to register this property, even though it is illegal, in order to get the payment of Arnona, the municipal tax, to be able to prove that you reside, you live in Jerusalem. So that's the irony of the Israeli law, that in order to protect your right, you have to violate the planning and zoning. If we talk about the Palestinian resilience in the city, I think Palestinians get to the conclusion that there is no horizon for any political solution. With the Trump acceptance of Jerusalem, I don't know what is Jerusalem for which boundaries we are talking about, they are less convinced that the Palestinian Authority and the national movement is able to fulfill its commitment for including East Jerusalem as part of the Palestinian independent state. We don't believe anymore as a Jerusalemite that this is going to happen. So people are still more and more focusing on survival, individual survival, almost no attempt to turn this individual survival into collective survival. And all these phenomena that you can see, that I don't think they indicate that there is less or more acceptance to the Israeli system. Simply there is an attempt to survive, to use all techniques to survive and to secure their basic needs. So if we are saying that these basic needs of access to education, access to the city physically, and for economy and for employment, if we consider this as a recognition of the Israeli sovereignty on Jerusalem, I think this is a misleading assumption. It's not. It is the basic needs of the Palestinians. Now, beside that we lost hope with the political horizon, with the political future solution, I think also the Palestinian Jerusalemites, they are more into the daily life needs. We are not seeking any future solution in terms of the political solution. The Palestinian Authority is unable, I mean, with the law back in '94 preventing the Palestinian institutions from operating in Jerusalem, despite the Norwegian commitment, the famous letter of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to Paris about protecting Palestinian institutions. This did never happen, and in the contrary. I mean, in the last 20 years, the civil society in East Jerusalem were totally dismissed, and actually it left the city to Ramallah, which became the alternative for the city of Jerusalem. So that's what's happening now. So 15 minutes is, do I have another 2 minutes?
You have another 2 minutes if you want, because you're talking about fascinating things. So if you want to complete in 2 minutes, please go ahead.
If we talk about the COVID-19, I call it the illusion of sovereignty. After 53 years, if Israel is trying to impose its sovereignty on a group of population that they don't know yet how to deal with them in all terms, in terms of services, in terms of their basic needs, in terms of their citizenship, non-citizenship, in terms of the demographic threat. I mean, at the end, we are talking about 400,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. Again, there is also this unclear policy by the Israeli system itself. I mean, they pushed between 120 to 160,000 Palestinians to live in neighborhoods outside of the wall. They are cut from the city of Jerusalem. We talk about Kufr Aqab in the north. We talk about Shafat refugee camp in the east, just neighboring the French Hill settlement, which is just 2-3 kilometers from the old city. So we are creating a new frontier in the city. So if we talk about the greater metropolitan, Jewish metropolitan, this is not on reality. On the ground, you have a harsh reality of checkpoints, of frontiers, of borders. Instead of having border between the West Bank and East Jerusalem, now we have even borders between the different neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. So 140, 120, 160,000 of Palestinian Jerusalemites, meaning they are cut from the city. We are actually, the Israeli system managed to push them out. There was no whatever policy to stop any illegal building. They were all illegal building. 25,000 units were built in the last 15 years in these neighborhoods cut by the wall. That's a fact. So pushing 1/3 of the Palestinian Jerusalemites out of the city, reducing the ratio again. We are going back to the same demographic engineering. We are like taking out 1/3 of the Palestinians out of the city. This is what is keeping the Israelis busy with, not the Palestinian civil right or with the Palestinian right for development. I mean, if you are preventing Palestinians from developing their own space, especially the residential, with a shortage of housing, and making a big dramatic announcement about an economic plan like in Wadi Joz as a high-tech new Silicon Valley, where the 200,000 square meters, they have not even 1 centimeter of residential. You talk about a shortage of at least 20, if not 30,000 apartments in Jerusalem. People are simply moving out of the city because of affordability. I mean, they cannot afford having any housing solution inside the city. All in all, Palestinian built-up area is 10,000 dunam. It's a 10 kilometer, which is 7% of the entire city territory. So if we talk about 40% of the population actually occupying 7%, which is 14% of the west of the East Jerusalem, the occupied territory in 67. So there's something wrong here. There is something wrong about the urban rights of the Palestinians, the economic rights. I don't think the Israeli system is serious about it. They are just creating another facts on the ground. The territorial domination of a Jewish majority and the demographobia when it's come to the Palestinians is still the main stream, the main line behind the Israeli policy, despite all this nice talk about, the technology, the high-tech, Palestinians have a similar rights, they don't have a similar right. Now, when we talk about the mixing, it's for the very simple reason. I mean, if you don't have a park in East Jerusalem, do you expect these kids to stay in a high dense neighborhood? They just go to a Jewish park where it is divided by time. You see only Palestinians and ultra-Orthodox. Maybe the others they don't need. So this is the most vulnerable community classes on both sides. the lack of spaces on this side of the city is actually the reason why we are using the space on the other side of the city, especially in neutral spaces, which is parks, shopping malls, the frontier between East and West. This is, we feel safe to go and to walk in some of these areas. And I don't think this is a new attempt to create a mixing, or we are still living separately, two communities. We don't even communicate in terms of language, in terms of culture. You can see even now more women with hijab just going, receiving their education in the western part of the city, in Hadassah College, in other vocational training institutions. That's something that we admire as a Palestinians, the education and the health system. But this is still far from saying that we are accepting Israel as a sovereign state on an occupied city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasrallah. It was fascinating, especially for me as a ex-Jerusalemite. But you know, when you talk about the Jewish majority, there is also a problem among the Jewish majority. There is no real one Jewish population in Jerusalem. There is the ultra-Orthodox and the secular, and from our perspective, we are the minority. So it's very interesting to look on Jerusalem from all these perspectives, and I want to open the floor and give it first to Itamar Mann, one of the principal investigators of the Minerva Center. Itamar, please.
Thank you so much for these presentations. My question goes to Dr. Nasrallah, as well as Oren Shlomo, perhaps, follows from the comments that the very interesting presentation that Ramy Nasrallah gave us provided. So you distinguish between functional rights and a kind of individual interest to protect oneself on a very basic level, and political identity, where I think that you said that those Palestinians in Jerusalem that exercise or demand even functional rights are doing that without any relationship with political identity, which is, it can be some shade of conservative identity, as you say, but it's not demonstrative of any consent to Israeli government, if I understand correctly. It's just a form of obtaining benefits, which are entirely understandable. But my question is really if this strategy of obtaining benefits requires some level of organization among communities, whether it is subject to some level of criticism from people who don't believe in this strategy. And if that is the case, whether over the long term or the medium term, we are already kind of in the medium term right now. I don't believe this process began yesterday. It does develop into some sort of political identity because it becomes a collective project to some degree. And if so, if that is correct, what are the outlines of that collective project? What is its kind of end game? You say that the end game is not, as I understand, to transform Jerusalem into part of a Palestinian state, because there's no longer a real belief in that possibility. But I'm sure there is some kind of horizon if this is indeed something that people not only do for themselves, but also try to do for other family members and try to defend as a matter of kind of a collective strategy. And if this is directed to Dr. Nasrallah, but I think that maybe Oren Shlomo also has expertise that allows him to reflect on this question. Perhaps not, but maybe.
Yeah, I can add to this question because, you know, independently from recognizing the sovereignty of Israel, the participation in municipal life, political participation, does not actually stand in contrast to the solution. And I wonder whether you see any more Palestinian Jerusalemites vote in the municipal election, or even want to participate in the political structure of Jerusalem, and whether you think that this will develop into this. So maybe we start with Dr. Nasrallah, then Oren.
I think the only grassroots organization which worked in the last, I would say, few years was the all related to Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's no one agenda which can bring Palestinian Jerusalemites into accepting a more collective action in all manners. I don't think there is also a trust with the Israeli system. There was an experience in the 90s and in early 2000 for communities to come with their alternative community planning. We worked with several plans, several communities. Actually, none of these plans were authorized by the Israeli system. For a very simple reason, they will ask you how many housing units. Even the general plans, which is the Tukhnit Av, in the neighborhoods of Beit Hanina, Surbah, Jabal Mukabbar, didn't include any expansion area as they were identified in the Master Plan 2000. So even the Israeli system is taking two steps back in terms of looking at the Palestinian space in developing Palestinian planning rights. So people don't really trust the Israeli system. Take, for example, Jabal Mukabbar. Jabal Mukabbar, the same mayor near Barkat, he was announcing many times this plan will be authorized. Until these days, this plan never brought into discussion with the district committee. So there's completely a mistrust with the Israeli system when it comes to the basic urban rights of the Palestinians. So I don't expect from them to be even organized around these urban or civil rights related to Israel. We should not forget that until Oslo, East Jerusalem enjoyed a functional autonomy. All hospitals, all cultural centers, all schools, all sport, media, clubs, they were all Palestinian institutions. These days, there's a shrinking Palestinian functionality. It's now limited to some schools, limited to the sport clubs, and a little of culture, but other than that, nothing, including in health. Because of the health insurance, we don't use our Palestinian hospitals. They used to be a central hospitals for the entire West Bank, like Al-Maqasid, Al-Muttala, Al-Hilal. We have at least 6 hospitals who we don't really use anymore, except those who became part of the Israeli health system. That's the dramatic change took place in the last 25 years of the Oslo peace process, replacing the Palestinian functionality with an Israeli functionality, and it's still taking place. I think the attempt of the state and its agencies to challenge the identity of Jerusalem is a major obstacle for Palestinians to engage in any community organization to go further. I would say to go further when it's come to Israel and accepting Israel. So it's not by coincidence that I say the only grassroots initiative which succeeded was the protest in Al-Haram al-Sharif in 2017, even now. So that's the only agenda which can bring Palestinians together, because we are defending the last, I would say, symbol of the Palestinian national identity in the city. This is also the way we look at Al-Aqsa Mosque. When Israelis are not willing to give up their sovereignty right on Al-Haram al-Sharif, we look at this as a threat. So we should not forget that this city is still a conflict city. The ethno-national conflict is still dominant, despite all attempts to show whether there is a direction for a solution which didn't work political resolution didn't work, but also to show that there is a civil agenda and there is a will on the Israeli system to accept us and to give us more. This is an illusion. I don't think this is going to happen. And I doubt that this 5-year plan is going to be completed.
Thank you, Dr. Nasrallah. Dr. Shlomo?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I have one comment to make. Of course, I didn't mean in my talk to argue that Palestinians in East Jerusalem accept Israeli identity or Israeli sovereignty, or they become part of the Israeli project or the Zionist project or whatever. Of course not. It was not my intention. I just wanted to point out to a process, a new process, in which in the last 2 decades, like you said, Rami, Israel took over on most of the urban functionalities in East Jerusalem, of course. And alongside this process, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, after the building the wall, they've been forced to encounter with Israeli labor market, urban economy, services. They don't have any choice, of course. It's all by forced adaptation, of what I call. They're forced to adapt to Israeli. Now, I say that we need to investigate this process, because this process puts some facts on the ground, and these facts are very interesting to analyze. And of course, the context of all this process is the context of the occupation and discrimination and the house demolition and the restrictions on planning and the special conflict. That's of course the context of my talk. Now, as far as the Palestinian identity, I don't think I can answer that question. I think Palestinians and Rami can talk about it and give a much more clear answer for that. I don't believe in a kind of a hybrid identity or something like that. This is a talk for sociologists or Palestinian experts in this manner.
Thank you, Oren. Dr. Robert Neufeld, who is another postdoc at the Minerva Center, you had comments and questions, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, let me just start by saying it's a great start for this webinar. It's a very interesting panel. My questions are mostly to Rottem on the legal side, which I come from, but I would say that if time permits, I would love to hear a bit more from Dr. Nasrallah and Dr. Shlomo about the COVID-19. Dr. Nasrallah started talking about it in one aspect, but the question is more like, how does the East Jerusalem Palestinians treat the COVID-19 pandemic regulations by the Ministry of Health here in Israel? Do they listen to the Palestinian Ministry of Health? How do they live at these times? It's very interesting to hear if it's one more aspect of what Oren was speaking about. But again, back to my original questions and comments. As far as I recall, when going as a legal advisor in the security establishment here, the 1945 regulations did deal with internal threats. There were actually the original intent was to deal with Jewish uprising by the British mandate. So the shift, I don't know about the shift from external threats into more like internal threats process that you are looking at. And I wrote the question down before. In terms of hyper-legality, in what sense is the 2016 Act different from other similar counter-terror acts around the world? Because many of them, as far as I can see them, are doing these classifications of persons and organizations and many of them, or if not all of them, use special procedures and commissions and tribunals. In fact, it's if you compare it to the 1945 regulations, you see that like there's no more military court in law, that there was no, everything came back into the civil, regular justice system. This was the major change. So I could not understand, if you could clarify a bit, how do you see this for moving into like a homegrown terrorist issue from the external threat to internal? Because I couldn't see the way that we are different than other countries around the world.
Thank you, Robert. I can follow up, Robert, actually, and say that I think that I disagree with you that the counterterrorism law should be analyzed in the context of the new reality of the territories vis-a-vis Israel, or Israel vis-a-vis the territories. As Robert said, you know, the counterterrorism law is part of a global wave of counterterrorism laws, and ours is not the worst. Actually, it's, you know, from the perspective of balancing the human rights and the security issues, it's much better than the Patriot Act, the American Patriot Act. And in some aspects, it's better than the British legislation. And especially in this process of declaring an organization as a terror organization, which according to our law is almost a judicial decision and not a political decision, in order not to exploit this politically. And this law is actually employed also in the past mostly against Jewish terrorists and terrorist organizations. So I'm not sure if this is part of the theme, and it will be interesting to see your reaction. By the way, it's interesting to connect Oren's presentation and to examine whether who is brought to court from the three different demonstration patterns according to the counterterrorism law, and who is brought to court according to the regular criminal law. You know, if people throw stones, for example, whether this will be prosecuted or channeled through the counterterrorism or through regular criminal procedure. And this might be an interesting indication whether you are right or whether my counter hypothesis is right. Yes, Rottem, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So we will have to wait for the empirical research. I have to say that from what I'm seeing so far, it's mainly Palestinian organizations that are being declared as terrorist organizations, and it's many Palestinian suspects and defendants that are being brought to court in accordance with the law. But you are certainly right that it's not just Palestinians. It's also Israeli citizens, including Jewish Israeli Jewish citizens and Jewish terrorist organizations. I think that we're starting to see a process of this type of legislation being applied to them. And I think to answer also Robert's and in a way Eddie's question concerning this idea that they're homegrown terrorists, I think that the main thing that for me proves this point is actually the fact that there is hardly any, when you look at the discussions of the committee drafting this law, there is hardly any distinction made. I mean, it's just everyone takes it for granted that the law will apply in Israel and that it will also apply in the occupied territories, and that it's mostly about, you know, regulating these organizations, many of which are tied to Hamas, civil organizations that you know work with Hamas, that support Hamas, that are tied to Hamas, whether or not we can define them as a terrorist organizations in accordance with the law. So we will have to wait for the empirical research. But when you look at the legislation process, this is definitely what I'm seeing. And with regard to the similarities to other countries, well, of course, Robert is right that it's true that hyper-legality is not, or these kind of special venues and arrangements are not special to Israel. Hussein wrote his article on hyper-legality due to his experience with the British legal system, the UK counterterrorism law. And UK counterterrorism law does have similar sort of venues and commissions to the Israeli law. Of course, they're not completely identical, but we definitely see similarities. So I certainly agree that the Israeli counterterrorism law is a part of this global counterterrorism trend. I think that the big question here is, who is the main target population? Because this differs, of course, very much from country to country. And also, why now, or why recently? What was it about that? Why did Israel now decide, that it needs this comprehensive counterterrorism legislation, that it needs to consolidate sort of these outdated laws? And I think that what we're seeing and what Hussein is trying to tell us in his article is that this type of counterterrorism legislation emerges when terrorism, or the population that you most fear when it comes to terrorism, has become a permanent occurrence. And you no longer think of this as some sort of extreme situation or emergency situation, but as a very integral part of your legal system. And I think this is what's happening with terrorism, with what Israel views as Palestinian terrorism. But I agree that the empirical research will be very significant here. And I'll get back to you, and maybe I'll have to concede, Eli, that we're right next year, when we do next year's event, or when I give next year's talk.
Thank you very much, Rottem. We could have continued our discussion for hours, but I think that our time is up. I would just say, Rottem, that I wish the Corona law that is voted on today would have such balances between individual rights and state issues, security, or other interests as the counter-terror law. But
yeah, no. Let me I just want to say, as I said at the beginning, my observations here are not normative but descriptive. I mean, I agree that some of these balances in the law, are better than what previously is, and I agree that the legislation process of the law, did give a voice to many organizations, including human rights organizations. So it's not my intention here to, necessarily go against the law. I'm again speaking more from a description.
Okay. So thank you very much for all the panelists, for all the participants and attendants, and we continue this conference on Monday at 4 o'clock, right?
Yes.
The next session is Monday. Michal and Ido, who are coordinating all this from administrative technical perspective. Thank you also very much. Michal, you want to say a word?
Just thank you to all the participants, and looking forward to Monday.
Looking forward to see you on Monday. Thank you.